The warning was not dramatic. It was not shouted across a briefing table or recorded in any official memorandum. It was delivered quietly, almost casually, between professionals who understood what the map represented. You were warned. The phrase circulated after a planning dispute in a contested zone where U.S. Army Rangers were expected to move first, secure entry corridors, and establish a forward presence. The complication was not the enemy alone. It was the operational environment the Australian SAS had already been shaping for days. The difference between the two units was not competence, it was philosophy. Rangers were structured for aggressive seizure of terrain, speed, shock, coordinated violence. Their doctrine emphasized initiative through momentum. The Australian SAS operated differently. They specialized in preconditioning a battle space before conventional or even elite units stepped inside it. Their work was often invisible: pattern disruption, targeted removals, manipulation of local perception, and deliberate ambiguity about their numbers and location. By the time the joint operation was proposed, the SAS had already inserted small teams into the zone. They were not holding ground, they were studying it. They mapped movement cycles, identified informal command figures, traced supply threads, and quietly removed specific individuals whose absence would not cause immediate alarm but would degrade coordination over time. When the Rangers reviewed aerial reconnaissance, the area appeared unstable but manageable. What they did not see was the invisible architecture the SAS had already altered. Communications were fragmented. Mid-level coordinators were missing. Local guides were uncertain whom to trust. The ecosystem was destabilized intentionally. Entering too early with visible force risked resetting the entire manipulation process. From the Ranger perspective, delay meant surrendering tempo. From the SAS perspective, premature entry meant destroying strategic leverage. The tension grew not from distrust, but from incompatible timelines. Rangers sought controlled violence to impose order quickly. The SAS sought controlled uncertainty to hollow the structure from within. During final planning, intelligence intercepts suggested hostile elements were consolidating in response to rumors of foreign movement. That consolidation was not accidental, it was being steered. The SAS had allowed selective signals to leak, guiding adversaries toward a predictable clustering point. The trap required patience. A visible Ranger insertion would scatter that clustering instantly. When Ranger Command pressed for immediate action, an Australian officer responded evenly. If you move now, you walk into a structure we are still dismantling. The zone was not simply hostile, it was calibrated. IED networks had been observed but not yet neutralized. Safe houses were under watch, not yet compromised. Sniper overwatch positions were in place, but their existence depended on the illusion of limited foreign presence. A large insertion would trigger contingency plans the SAS had deliberately kept dormant. The Rangers were capable of fighting through it. That was never in question. The issue was cost. Casualties, escalation, loss of strategic surprise. The warning, "You were warned," was less a threat than a statement of consequence. If you enter before the structure collapses, you inherit the instability at its peak. And in that moment, the decision was not about bravery. It was about whose doctrine would define the battle before the first visible step into the zone. The disagreement intensified because both sides were correct within their own frameworks. Rangers are engineered to dominate space the moment they touch it. Their confidence comes from movement under pressure, from compressing chaos through force. Delay feels unnatural to a unit built around controlled aggression. But the SAS did not measure control by presence, they measured it by influence. By the time Joint Command revisited the timeline, the Australians had already shifted several invisible variables inside the zone. A local facilitator who had quietly linked multiple cells had disappeared. 2 weapons caches had been relocated without public discovery, creating logistical confusion among hostile groups. Informal checkpoints had begun appearing in unexpected places as factions questioned each other's loyalty. The environment was not stabilizing, it was eroding internally. That erosion required secrecy. The more uncertainty spread, the more adversaries turned inward, searching for betrayal rather than preparing outward defense. A Ranger insertion at that stage would unify them instantly. A visible external threat erases internal suspicion. The SAS objective was to keep fragmentation alive until it matured into paralysis. Intelligence updates confirmed rising tension among hostile elements. Intercepted communications showed disagreement over leadership, accusations of compromised routes, abrupt changes in meeting locations. To the Rangers, that volatility signaled urgency. Instability can explode without warning. To the SAS, volatility signaled progress. Instability, if directed carefully, consumes itself. The zone had effectively become a pressure chamber. The Australians were regulating the valves slowly. Introduce a large kinetic presence too early, and the chamber detonates outward instead of collapsing inward. During final coordination, Ranger planners requested definitive confirmation that the environment would be permissive enough within a defined window. The SAS response was clinical. Permissive is the wrong metric. We are not making it safe, we are making it hollow. That distinction reframed the debate. Safety implies cleared threats. Hollowness implies structural weakness. When a structure is hollow, it can fall with minimal push, but only if you wait until the internal supports are fully compromised. Surveillance indicated that key hostile figures were beginning to centralize for emergency coordination, exactly as intended. The clustering point was becoming predictable. Sniper Overwatch had range solutions prepared. Demolition contingencies were mapped. Extraction corridors were rehearsed repeatedly in silence. The Rangers were briefed on the plan, allow the clustering to complete, remove the coordinating layer in a synchronized sequence, then enter into a leadership vacuum rather than into active resistance. The risk was temporal. If clustering dispersed prematurely, the opportunity would dissolve. If Rangers entered visibly, clustering would disperse immediately. The refusal to enter was not fear of combat. It was recognition that combat at that moment would reward the wrong phase of the enemy's adaptation cycle. You were warned evolved from tension into doctrine acknowledgement. Rangers would not enter, not because they could not, but because doing so would convert a controlled implosion into a chaotic firefight. And in that zone, chaos favored whoever reacted fastest, not whoever understood it best. As the window narrowed, the difference between action and restraint became almost physical. Recon feeds showed increased movement toward the designated clustering site. Couriers arrived at irregular intervals. Security posture tightened but remained inward-facing. No perimeter expansion, no outward patrol surge. The factions were bracing against internal fracture, not external assault. That was the confirmation the SAS had been waiting for. The structure was bending under its own mistrust. Rangers remained staged outside the zone, fully equipped, fully capable, fully aware that every hour of delay contradicted instinct. Yet discipline held. Because this was no longer a question of who could fight harder. At a specific node, not broad jamming, just at a specific node, not broad jamming, just a narrow disruption to isolate the meeting cluster. Second, simultaneous precision removals of two secondary coordinators positioned as fallback leaders, not high-profile figures, structural ones. Third, controlled detonation of a previously identified munitions storage site, positioned close enough to induce panic but not wide-area alert. The effect was immediate and asymmetric. Inside the cluster, confusion spiked. Without secondary leadership and without clear communication, authority blurred. Orders overlapped. Accusations resurfaced. Movement toward escape routes collided with pre-positioned overwatch. It lasted minutes, not hours. By the time Rangers received clearance to enter, resistance was fragmented and leaderless. There was no unified counterattack, no organized defensive line, only scattered attempts at withdrawal. The entry that had once threatened to ignite a consolidated defense instead unfolded into controlled containment. Rangers secured structures quickly, encountering sporadic fire, but no coordinated pushback. The zone had not been pacified by force alone, it had been emptied of cohesion before the first visible boots crossed the boundary. In the after-action review, the language shifted subtly. The initial hesitation was no longer described as delay, it was described as sequencing discipline. Rangers acknowledged that had they entered 48 hours earlier, they would have faced a concentrated defensive posture, likely reinforced by unified local support networks. Instead, they stepped into an adversary already fractured by its own distrust. The refusal to enter had preserved leverage. "You were warned" ceased to sound like friction between allies. It sounded like a reminder of phase alignment. Entering a battle space is not always the beginning of control. Sometimes it is the final step of a process already unfolding invisibly. The SAS had shaped the environment until force became confirmation rather than catalyst. and the Rangers, by waiting, ensured that when they moved they inherited advantage instead of resistance. What followed was not celebration, but recalibration. The operation became a study in phase dominance, who controls which stage of conflict, and when transition becomes irreversible. Rangers had executed with precision once inside the zone, but the decisive advantage had been established before their insertion. The Australians had demonstrated that shaping precedes seizing. If you seize too early, you inherit resistance at full strength. If you shape long enough, you seize vacuum. That distinction reshaped how both units viewed joint sequencing. It was no longer about lead element prestige, it was about structural timing. The deeper lesson was uncomfortable because it challenged instinct. Elite units are conditioned to close distance with threat, not orbit it. Waiting feels passive, but in this case, waiting was aggression at a different layer. The SAS had attacked trust, predictability, and coordination before a single overt engagement. By the time Rangers crossed into the zone, the enemy's center of gravity had already shifted from external defense to internal suspicion. That shift reduced the density of resistance without reducing capability. Capability still existed. It simply lacked alignment, and alignment is what makes resistance dangerous. In closed-door reviews, commanders noted that the most critical moment of the operation was not the synchronized removals or the Ranger entry. It was the decision to hold outside the perimeter when intelligence signaled volatility. That was the inflection point. Choosing not to move preserved the integrity of the shaping phase. Had impatience prevailed, the zone would have unified against visible intrusion. Instead, it imploded under curated pressure. The phrase "you were warned" endured because it encapsulated that inflection. It was not defiance, it was phase awareness. Enter too early, and you strengthen what you intend to weaken. Enter at the correct moment, and you inherit what has already weakened itself. Modern conflict increasingly rewards this logic. Networks are adaptive, groups fragment and recombine rapidly. The side that manipulates cohesion indirectly often achieves more than the side that confronts it directly. In that operation, the Rangers did not refuse to enter out of caution. They refused because they recognized that entry is a tool, not a reflex, and when finally deployed it should confirm collapse, not provoke consolidation. The zone was never simply a location on a map, it was a system under stress. The Australians increased that stress invisibly. The Rangers applied visible force only after structural failure was assured. Together the outcome appeared seamless, but beneath that seam was a disciplined pause that made the difference between a firefight and a dismantling. In the broader context, the operation became a reference for something rarely discussed openly: interoperability at the level of doctrine, not equipment. Radios can sync, weapons can align, airspace can be deconflicted, but doctrine requires trust. The Rangers had to trust that an invisible shaping phase was achieving measurable erosion. The SAS had to trust that once the collapse point was reached, overt force would execute cleanly and without hesitation. That mutual restraint was the real test. Most joint friction emerges from timing disputes. Each unit sees a window differently because each is optimized for a different phase of conflict. Rangers dominate entry and expansion. The SAS dominates destabilization and compression. The zone demanded both, but in sequence, not simultaneously. Afterward, analysts dissected the operation through data, movement heat maps, intercept frequency drops, casualty ratios, time to secure metrics. The numbers supported what intuition had resisted: delayed entry, reduced total engagement duration, and minimized secondary escalation. Civilian displacement in the surrounding area was lower than projected. Reinforcement attempts from adjacent sectors were disorganized. The adversary never regained a coherent defensive narrative. That outcome did not emerge from superior firepower alone, it emerged from phase control. The warning had been about phase control from the beginning. If Rangers had entered prematurely, they would have been forced into a visible contest of strength. By waiting, they entered an environment already weakened by doubt. Doubt is corrosive. It spreads without detonations. It erodes loyalty, clarity, and confidence. The SAS injected doubt methodically. The Rangers capitalized on its maturity. In later training exchanges, the phrase resurfaced less as a caution and more as a principle. Never interrupt a collapse that is working in your favor. The hardest discipline in elite operations is not action, it is restraint in the presence of readiness. The Rangers were ready, the helicopters were fueled, the routes were mapped, the perimeter was within reach, but readiness does not equal necessity. The Australians understood that necessity must align with structural vulnerability, not emotional urgency. When that alignment finally occurred, the entry was decisive precisely because it was late. The zone did not explode, it folded, and folding requires less force than breaking. In the end, "you were warned" became less about one disagreement and more about operational maturity. Entering a battle space is a statement. Waiting outside it can be strategy. The difference between the two is measured not in courage, but in comprehension of how systems fail. And in that operation, failure was engineered quietly, long before the first Ranger stepped across the threshold. The final layer of that operation was not tactical, but cognitive. Both units walked away with reinforced clarity about where real leverage lives. It is not always at the point of contact. Often it is upstream, inside behavior, inside expectation, inside the fragile agreements that hold hostile networks together. The SAS attacked those agreements first. The Rangers ensured that once broken, they stayed broken. That sequencing created an outcome that looked inevitable in hindsight. But inevitability is usually the result of discipline applied earlier than comfort allows. In post-mission evaluations, one observation surfaced repeatedly. The most dangerous moment was not during entry, nor during synchronized removals. It was during the waiting period, when impatience could have rewritten the entire trajectory. Elite units are conditioned to solve problems through decisive movement. Standing still while equipped for action requires a different kind of confidence. The Rangers demonstrated that confidence. They did not refuse to enter out of reluctance. They refused because entering at the wrong phase would have transformed strategic erosion into tactical collision. Collision favors whoever adapts fastest under pressure. Erosion favors whoever designed the pressure. The Australians had designed it. Once the collapse sequence executed, Ranger force became confirmation rather than provocation. There was no dramatic last stand, no symbolic firefight that would inspire recruitment narratives. Instead, there was containment, documentation, and controlled dismantling of what remained. The absence of spectacle was the indicator of success. Spectacle implies resistance at full coherence. This operation encountered resistance at partial disintegration. That difference reduced duration, reduced exposure, reduced ripple effects beyond the zone. Over time, the story evolved inside professional circles into a doctrine reminder. Entry is the visible phase of influence, not the beginning of it. The warning was not about danger, it was about timing discipline. If you enter before fragmentation peaks, you unify the fragments. If you enter after, you inherit silence. The Rangers chose silence, and in doing so, they validated something larger than one operation. They validated that elite capability is not measured solely by willingness to engage, but by the wisdom to wait until engagement multiplies advantage instead of risk. The zone did not become famous, it did not produce a headline, but inside planning rooms, its lesson endured. "You were warned" was never a rebuke. It was a reminder that in modern conflict, the most decisive move is often the one you delay, until the system you are about to enter has already begun collapsing on its own. Years later, when similar joint operations were modeled on digital simulations and wargamed across multiple theaters, planners would reference that case without always naming it. The core takeaway had matured into doctrine language: never substitute momentum for alignment. Momentum feels powerful. It creates clarity of purpose and compresses uncertainty through action. But alignment, between timing, environment, and adversary cohesion, creates outcomes that require less force to sustain. In that zone, alignment was achieved because one unit resisted the urge to initiate, and the other trusted the process shaping the field ahead of them. That trust is rare. It demands confidence not only in your own capability, but in your partner's invisible work. The SAS had accepted that they would not be the visible face of the operation. The Rangers had accepted that their strength would matter more if applied later rather than first. That mutual concession is what made the sequence effective. Modern battlefields increasingly reward this kind of layered patience. Networks fracture faster than ever, but they also reassemble faster under visible threat. The key variable is perception. If an adversary believes collapse is internal, fragmentation accelerates. If collapse appears externally imposed, cohesion rebounds in self-defense. The Australians maintained the illusion of internal instability long enough for it to become real. The Rangers entered only after that reality had hardened. That is the difference between forcing a door and walking through one already unhinged. In quiet professional reflection, the operation became an example of maturity over impulse, not because it avoided combat, but because it controlled when combat occurred. The refusal to enter was not an act of hesitation, it was an act of design preservation. Entering early would have destroyed weeks of invisible architecture. Waiting preserved it until it could no longer support itself. And that is the enduring principle. The most powerful move in conflict is not always the first visible one. It is the one that arrives exactly when resistance has exhausted its own foundation. You were warned ultimately became shorthand for something deeper. Respect the phase you are in. Do not interrupt collapse for the sake of activity, and never confuse readiness with necessity. In that zone, necessity arrived precisely because someone chose not to move too soon. In the end, what remained was not rivalry, not tension, and not a story about one elite unit outmaneuvering another. What remained was confirmation that modern conflict is governed by sequencing more than strength. The Rangers did not refuse because the zone was too dangerous. They refused because danger was still being shaped into opportunity. That distinction defines professional maturity. Strength is easy to display, timing is harder to master. The SAS had been bending the internal geometry of the battle space for days, pulling pressure points until alignment began to crack from within. The Rangers understood that stepping in prematurely would reset that geometry, turning inward fracture into outward resistance. When they finally crossed into the zone, they were not testing dominance, they were verifying collapse, and verification requires far less force than confrontation. The operation closed without spectacle, which is often the clearest indicator that sequencing was correct. No extended firefight, no prolonged siege, no cascading reinforcement cycle. Just controlled entry into a structure that had already lost coherence. In retrospective analysis, the defining moment was not kinetic at all. It was the quiet agreement to hold position when every instinct encouraged movement. That pause preserved advantage, that pause reduced cost. That pause demonstrated that elite capability is not measured by how quickly you can enter a fight, but by how precisely you can choose when not to. You were warned, ultimately distilled into a professional ethic. Never interrupt a process that is collapsing in your favor. Respect the phase, respect the architecture of influence already in motion. And above all, understand that in complex environments, patience is not passive. It is pressure applied invisibly until resistance folds under its own weight. The Rangers entered only when entry confirmed inevitability, and that is why the zone did not explode, it unraveled.